Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us wherever you may be. It's the great honor and pleasure of the program on Taiwan and the Indo-Pacific region to be able to host one of the keenest and best informed observers and analysts of Taiwan politics, national security, and cross-strait relations, Michael Cole. Before I turn it over to my colleague, Glenn Tiffert, to introduce Michael and moderate this session, I did want to, once again, now in this new format, thank our partners and supporters of this project, the Taipei Economic and Cultural Office, and to say that now more than ever, in an era of this awful global pandemic, and we certainly hope that all of you are staying safe and healthy, and in an era when the People's Republic of China is trying to exploit this horrible global crisis in a very crude way and with intense disinformation to advance its authoritarian geopolitical aims. Now more than ever, we need this project to understand the unique role that Taiwan is playing, both as a liberal democracy demonstrating almost unprecedented success among liberal democracies in managing the coronavirus pandemic, and as a liberal democracy that is on a second front line, and that is the front line of PRC authoritarian pressure and authoritarian sharp power projection. So we're going to continue our work, even if we have to do it for some time to come through this virtual medium. We thank you for joining us, and we turn it over to Glenn.
Hello to attendees wherever you may be and whatever time of day it may be for you. It's a great pleasure to introduce Michael Cole. Michael Cole comes to us today directly from Taipei, where he's been generous enough to join us at what is a very early morning hour for him. He is part, and this event is part of our regular Taiwan speaker series. We have an event approximately once a month. In light of recent events, we're transitioning to an online format. Our next event should be in early May, and we encourage all attendees to join our Hoover Taiwan announcements list so that you can receive information about upcoming events. Right now, there should be an email address on your screen. You can jot that down and subscribe to our mailing list. It's a very low traffic mailing list. It only distributes information about upcoming events, and we'll show the slide again at the end of this presentation at the end of the hour, so you'll have a second crack at it. Michael Cole first came to my attention several years ago as one of the most perceptive observers of Taiwanese politics in the English language. In particular, his coverage of the Sunflower movement in Taipei garnered a great deal of international recognition. He is currently a senior fellow with the Global Taiwan Institute in Washington and the Macdonald-Laurier Institute in Ottawa, Canada. And he has a number of other important affiliations. He had an earlier career as an intelligence officer in the Canadian Security and Intelligence Service, and has a degree in war studies and in a diploma in peacekeeping from the Lester Pearson International Peacekeeping Center. After that, he became well known as a journalist and has written for many publications, including Foreign Policy, Nikkei Asian Review, The Wall Street Journal, Christian Science Monitor, and South China Morning Post. He comes to us now on the heels of having published his most recent book, entitled Cross-Strait Relations Since 2016, The End of the Illusion. It is out in Routledge under the Routledge imprint. This is the fifth book he's written on Taiwan, and also accompanies a number of academic articles he's written on the subject too, many of which have been published in Chinese, and so some of you may know him as Kou Mijiang. And so I want to turn over the platform to him, and he will speak for about 45 minutes. And then I encourage you all to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens to post questions at the end. We'll run this very much like a live on-campus event, and then Michael will answer your questions in the last half hour. Thank you, Michael, and I turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Glenn and Larry, for the kind introduction, and to the Hoover Institute for having me speak today. In time of emergency, technology surely allows us to transcend borders, but unfortunately, we have yet to come up with an application that transcends time zones. So I'm giving this talk today where it's currently a little bit after 1 a.m. Taiwan time. So if when I'm tired, my French Canadian accent tends to be a bit more pronounced, so my apologies for that. In December last year, when Glenn first approached me, we first began discussing the possibility of my giving a talk at Hoover. The plan was for me to be there in person, and with elections in Taiwan just around the corner, the idea was for me to talk about cross-strait relations in general terms. There was also to be an occasion where I could present my new book, Cross-Strait Relations Since 2016, which, as Glenn said, was published last month. Then in a matter of weeks, our plans were somewhat derailed. The talk is online, as you all realize. And while I do intend to talk about cross-strait relations and the findings in my new book, I will now do so in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, and use this to illustrate how, even as the world faces its greatest health crisis in decades, arguably, that the fundamentals of cross-strait relations and cross-strait politics remain unchanged. Now, before we begin, I must make a few things clear. I've been working and living in Taiwan for the past 15 years. I moved here in 2005. As with many other people who have visited the country or made it their home, I've fallen in love with it and certainly decided to make it my home. Over the years, as my understanding of the dispute in the Taiwan Strait deepened, I've also become convinced that the story of Taiwan is a much bigger issue than the Taiwan Strait, or an internal matter for the Chinese people to resolve. It's also about regional security, it's about geopolitics, and I would add it's also about the very future of democracy. Thus, the fate of Taiwan will have an impact not just on the 23.8 million people here in Taiwan, but also on the entire community of nations. And I do believe that it sits on the right side of history, and that it stands for values and principles that are well worth defending. Of course, that position has led to accusations over the years that my work, whether it's journalism, commentary, or academic, is quote unquote biased. So yes, admittedly, I am biased in favor of democracy and human rights, and I am opposed to authoritarianism. I believe it is my duty as an intellectual and as a human being to get involved. Does it mean that I hate China? Absolutely not. I'm fascinated by it and by its history. And my fight is with the CCP, not with the Chinese people. Of course, we cannot discuss the situation today in a historical vacuum, though my purpose here isn't to give a history lesson. But nevertheless, I must place what is happening today in a proper framework. So my point of departure for this talk today is the second term of the Ma Ying-jeou administration. Or if I may plug another book of mine, my previous book with Routledge, Convergence or Conflict in the Taiwan Strait, which was published in 2016. Now, so whether the KMT or DPP is in office, the aims of the CCP have remained pretty consistent. Insistence on eventual peaceful unification, largely on the PRC's terms, I would argue, under a one country, two systems formula, and built upon, if you will, upon the so-called 1992 consensus. Under the KMT and Ma Ying-jeou, so from 2008 until 2016, Beijing's tone was certainly less belligerent. There were more incentives and fewer elements of coercion, but the objectives remained the same. Now, the impact of the Sunflower Movement and Taiwan's democratic firewall is certainly not negligible. There was more emphasis on political warfare, or what we call sharp power, starting in the second term of President Mao, where we started seeing more bypassing of central government institutions by the different organizations and agencies and individuals on the Chinese side who were charged with China's political warfare campaign against Taiwan. And we certainly saw an escalation of those efforts and activities following the 3 intense weeks of the Sunflower Movement in Taiwan, which included the occupation of the legislature over what had been termed a black box cross-strait services trade agreement with the Chinese side. Around that time, I think it's also very important to point out the rise of Xi Jinping and his impact on CCP discourse. Under him, the positions became much harder than they had been under his predecessor, Hu Jintao, which, even when it was still in office, put the KMT in a very difficult position, as notwithstanding its authoritarian past, the KMT now operates in a democracy and needed to operate within those rules and to find ways to appeal via democratic means to the Taiwanese public. So therefore, it became harder and harder for the KMT to argue that the two sides, for example, agreed to disagree on the different interpretations of One China, which had been one of the key elements or selling points, if you will, for the KMT in explaining its policies to the Taiwanese public. Also, the passage of China's new national security law in 2015 now includes language on Taiwan and also raises the specter of extraterritorial application of laws regarding separatism to Taiwanese nationals, wherever they are. So travel to the PRC, even when Mao was still in office, by Taiwanese nationals was already getting more restricted, and even for Taiwanese academics seeking entry in Hong Kong. So we saw during those years these rapid erosion of Hong Kong's ability to control its own borders, and we found out that Beijing very much was calling the shots on who was allowed to enter and in some cases to leave Hong Kong. Later on, when Tsai Ing-wen had become president in 2017, we saw the arrest in China of Li Mingzhe, a human rights activist from Taiwan, who was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment on charges that very much fell under the remit of the new national security law. Now, Tsai Ing-wen's election in 2016 certainly led very quickly to ramped up efforts by the Chinese to undermine Taiwan's institutions through political warfare. Tsai's olive branch extended soon after she was elected, but also on Inauguration Day on May 20th, 2016, was not well received by Beijing, which the very same day referred to her remarks as an incomplete test. So it was a test for Beijing, and she supposedly failed. So we saw, nonetheless, the same formula of incentives, but more and more coercion, and the coercive aspects of Chinese policy vis-a-vis Taiwan became all the more important in the list of activities by the Chinese vis-a-vis Taiwan. The aims of Chinese Communist Party's political warfare efforts against Taiwan, I would argue, can be narrowed down to 5 main categories, and they are 1, to corrode, bypass, and manipulate democratic institutions, elections, and public trust therein. 2, to undermine morale and the targeted society and weaken resistance to Beijing's objectives by compounding feelings of abandonment, isolation, and historical inevitability. Third is to sow confusion, exacerbate divisions, polarization, and contradictions within Taiwanese society. The fourth one certainly does not limit itself to Taiwan, but is to co-opt elites, business people, politicians, retired military officers, civil society, and the media. And the last one is to coerce opponents and critics of the CCP, oftentimes through the threat of or the use of legal action against investigative journalists and academics. And I myself was a victim of that a couple of years ago, but I did win in court. The CCP's overall strategy of political warfare is defined via the Chinese People's Political Consultative Congress, so the CPPCC, which brings together various participants in this effort. So intelligence officers, diplomats, propagandists, party elders, military officers, United Front workers, academics, media workers, as well as business people. Under the CPPCC Standing Committee, the Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan Affairs Committee is in charge of orchestrating that strategy, which is then implemented by a number of agencies in China, among them the State Council's Taiwan Affairs Office, the People's Liberation Army, the United Front Work Department, as well as a number of ministries and a plethora of other actors within Chinese civil society and counterpart societies. Chinese agencies and United Front Work organs, I would argue, use the 8 years of liberalization or rapprochement in the Taiwan Strait under Ma Ying-jeou to establish a number of networks across Taiwan, again, in the media, in the business community, Buddhist temples across Taiwan, organized crime. So there's two main triads, the Bamboo Union and the Four Seas Gang, that have become a bit more politicized in recent years. And they also used that period to try to create dependencies, mostly through economics, which in the aggregate, Beijing hoped would influence policy in Taipei on cross-strait relations. We also saw, first time in 2015, the holding of cross-strait media forums, particularly in Xiamen and Beijing. At the first one in 2015, there were 31 individuals from Taiwanese media attending those series of briefings and conferences in Beijing. The most recent one that was held in May last year had more than 70 members from the media sector in Taiwan. And they were from print, TV, new media, that is online, radio, film distribution, production, PR companies. And that delegation was led by What China Times Group Chairman Tsai Ing-wen, who is Taiwan's second wealthiest individual, and over the years has been one of the key individuals facilitating the cross-strait cultural, economic activities that people like myself have been studying to determine whether they play a role in Chinese political warfare. And our conclusion is that they certainly do. We've also seen crude efforts to co-opt politicians and future candidates in Taiwanese elections. There was an op-ed in the Global Times a few years ago where they said that one of the key strategies was to balkanize or Lebanonize Taiwan through local organizations that are linked or collaborating with PRC counterparts. So we've seen, for example, the China Unification Promotion Party, which has close ties with the Bamboo Union triads. We saw the creation in Taichung in 2015 of the Red Party Taiwan. We have the New Party and others and different components of civil society that are trying to attract youth through incentive programs, but also trying to bypass central government altogether and basically propose solutions. If they want to conduct business with China, they need not rely upon Mainland Affairs Council or Straits Exchange Foundation. They can rely on those organizations to conduct their business in China. We saw the use of experimental free trade zones as well to create incentives for Taiwanese politicians with family members conducting business in those areas. And we've seen over the years that their policies have tended to shift and become increasingly favorable to Beijing. We've also seen another effort to balkanize Taiwanese society by rewarding municipalities that are governed by politicians who are more favorable to Beijing, politicians who embrace the so-called 1992 consensus, for example, while punishing municipalities and cities and localities that are governed by DPP or independent candidates who are seen to be more pro-Taiwanese independence. So all of this to demonstrate, particularly the weaponization of trade and all that, and we're certainly seeing this today in the context of COVID-19, is that for the CCP, everything is ultimately transactional, and that there's no such thing as goodwill. And goodwill is certainly a term that the CCP has used repeatedly as it attempts to convince the Taiwanese that they have a bright future with the PRC. Soon after Tsai was elected in 2016, we saw the weaponization of tourism, but we had seen that earlier as well when the KMT was in power. For example, when a film festival in Kaohsiung was to play a documentary about Rabia Kadir, one of the leaders of the Uyghur movement, the Chinese government made it clear that Chinese tour groups would avoid that city for a number of weeks to punish that city financially for daring to play a documentary that was deemed unpalatable by Beijing. When Tsai was elected, we first saw a reduction in the number of tour groups coming from China, and later on, free independent travelers were also having difficulties obtaining the visas from the Chinese side that they needed to come to Taiwan. So once again, that was meant to punish the Tsai administration for failing that test, if you will, but also to skip the municipalities that were governed by the DPP. Now, that strategy did not yield the hoped-for dividends for Beijing because that created incentives for the Taiwanese government to finally diversify its sources of tourism, particularly amidst efforts under the New Southbound policy to attract more visitors from across Southeast Asia. And that strategy not only worked and compensated for the Chinese boycott, but even led to Taiwan year after year beating records for tourist arrivals. So that was an early effort by the Chinese to punish Taiwan, and that very much was a failure. We also saw renewed efforts by Beijing to isolate Taiwan by poaching official diplomatic allies. We've seen 7 allies being taken away from Taiwan since President Tsai assumed office in 2016. And very relevant today, and it's in the news for obvious reasons, efforts by the Chinese to prevent Taiwan from participating in multilateral agencies, such as WHO, ICAO, Interpol, and others. Throughout all this, the CCP refuses to acknowledge the reality of Taiwan's democracy and the refusal of its people to be annexed by the PRC. It still maintains that splitism is limited to a small group of DPP politicians, as well as foreign agents, so people such as myself, the CIA, and increasingly the US government, the Japanese, and all that, so the usual suspects. Despite the crisis in Hong Kong in 2019, Beijing also refuses to move beyond the one country, two systems offer to Taiwan. And following remarks by Xi Jinping on January 2nd last year, when he made it pretty clear that the only offer on the table was the one country, two systems, and also made it clear that there no longer were different interpretations to what one China means. that particular address to Taiwanese compatriots made it even more difficult for the KMT to argue that its previous strategy of engagement with China was still viable. So that led to the KMT itself and a number of politicians stating clearly that one country, two systems is unviable, unacceptable for the Taiwanese people. So once again, we saw the impact of Taiwan's democracy on the ability of political parties to do and say certain things, and that's the value of democracy. The tone certainly has remained, Beijing's tone has remained contentious, from Taiwan Affairs Office to their Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And more we've seen Chinese embassies worldwide lecturing or berating the host governments for doing things with Taiwan. So for example, recently, the Chinese embassy in France depicted Tsai Ing-wen's re-elections in January 2020, as well as the congratulations by various governments as, and I paraphrase, like a toad that jumps on your foot, it doesn't bite, but it's disgusting. Now, we've certainly seen a changing global context and perceptions of China in recent years as well. Much of this, I would argue, is attributed to the rise of Xi Jinping, who has adopted a much more hardline policy, not only vis-a-vis Taiwan, but also in Chinese efforts to increase its influence abroad, as well as I said earlier, the crisis in Hong Kong last year, which certainly continues, even though it's in a bit of a hiatus right now because of the outbreak. Unfortunately, I've not seen much evidence that the revelations about concentration camps in Xinjiang have had much of an impact on perceptions of China overall. Among experts, very likely, but not within the general public. But I think more and more, and COVID-19 is making that all more clear as well, that the China that we're dealing with today under Xi Jinping is a very different China from the one only a decade ago under Hu Jintao or his predecessors. So this has resulted in greater engagement with Taiwan since 2016. The United States certainly has taken the lead. And there I would argue that the rise of President Trump has played a major role in this. Not so much because he has made Taiwan his priority, but because he has a number of other priorities. And given this, that has created more space and freedom, if you will, for policymakers in Washington, D.C. To do things that possibly they have wanted to do for years, but now it's actually acceptable and possible for them to do it. So we've seen a lot more engagement. There was a bit of a slow start initially because a number of agencies, particularly State Department, were not properly staffed. So there were a few events early on that United States and Taiwan were trying to organize that did not go too well because people in Washington, D.C. were simply not picking up the phone when Taiwanese MOFA or AIT were calling. But this has been resolved, and we've seen a lot of activity involving United States and Taiwan since 2016, not only at the unofficial level, but more and more officially State Department MOFA, Office of Religious Freedom and whatnot, and very visibly, and now Mike Pompeo tweeting, thanking Taiwan and all that. We've never seen this kind of exposure for Taiwan before. Now, U.S. leadership also eventually encouraged a number of other international partners to become more engaged with Taiwan, again, in the larger context of a general reassessment of the costs and benefits of engaging the PRC. Most of that occurred at the unofficial level, so track 1.5, track 2. We saw a number of global cooperation and training frameworks, or GCTF events, organized between US agencies from State Department to FBI with their counterparts in Taiwan, including 2 rounds on combating disinformation. We've had success in Taiwan having its voice at G7 meetings, for example, on, again, combating authoritarian influence. and oftentimes at the encouragement or with the intervention of unofficial partners of Taiwan, countries like Japan, for example. Religious Freedom Forum was held in Taiwan last year, a highly successful endeavor. Taiwan being able to attend forums like the Halifax International Security Forum, which it had not been able to do in the past. And then we saw countries like Japan, Australia, Sweden, Czech Republic, Canada, and EU members, to name a few, that also added their names to the list, sometimes officially, sometimes not, but collaborating with Taiwan, a lot more learning from its experiences dealing with China, but also providing their own assistance when necessary. We've also seen organizations like Reporters Without Borders deciding to open their first regional office in Taipei rather than Hong Kong, not only because of cost, but also because they realized that it would be much easier for them to conduct their work if they did so in an open and free society. They would have encountered difficulties, no doubt, if they had set up shop in Hong Kong. And now we're seeing a number of other organizations also looking to set up offices here in Taiwan. So much of this, I would argue, can be attributed to the careful, rational, and predictable policies adopted by the Tsai administration. They have respected other countries' limits on their engagement with Taiwan, and they very much refrained from the kind of activities or behavior that oftentimes was seen when Chen Shui-bian of the DPP was in office between 2000 and 2008, which oftentimes caused unnecessary surprises to counterparts who were a bit wary of their interactions with Taiwan being made public. And the very next day, those would appear in media in Taiwan and all that. So the Tsai administration learned from those lessons as well, and became a lot more understanding, if you will, of the limits of engagement and how careful they needed to be. And that has paid dividends. To be fair to former President Chen, the context has changed markedly, again, for the reasons that I listed above, but also because back then, when he was in office, the United States had just gone through 9/11. And as Paul Wolfowitz once told me in an interview, the US was also rather busy fighting two little wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So surprises were not welcome back then, and it was deemed more controversial for Washington to do things with Taiwan back then. But things have changed, and Taiwan has certainly seized upon those opportunities as well. During her first 4 years in office, Tsai's position has also gradually shifted. It went from the extension of an olive branch, as I said earlier, retention of the status quo, promising not to declare independence. Her administration has retained the official designation of Taiwan, that is Republic of China. She also mentioned that she recognizes the historical fact that there were meetings in 1992, but she will not recognize the 1992 consensus. And she also promised to not do any of the agreements that had been signed between Beijing and Taipei when President Ma Ying-jeou was in office. More recently, she has gradually adopted a more harder line on China, also vocally supporting protesters in Hong Kong and all that. And again, that is in response to the increasingly belligerent tone adopted by Beijing as well, and a global context that probably made it more permissible for Taiwan to be a little bit more vocal on that issue. Nonetheless, her position has gotten her into trouble in the deep green camp, so the more pro-independence elements within the DPP, which regarded her as too soft on China, unwilling to declare independence, and basically no better than the KMT. So within that group, we've seen the spread of disinformation, for example, pertaining to her having a fake diploma from the London School of Economics. There were elections in November 2018, which probably saw Tsai Ing-wen at her lowest point in her 4 years during the first term, where the DPP lost a number of municipalities in those elections. Tsai stepped down as chairwoman of the DPP at the time, and she was even challenged for the primary by former Tainan Mayor William Lai, which widened the split in the Green camp and certainly led to expectations that her re-election bid in 2020 would be quite challenging. Now, in those elections, according to the Ministry of Justice Investigation Bureau and Taiwan's National Security Bureau, PRC political warfare, so a combination of fake news, underground gambling on the elections, illegal funding from the PRC via business people for a number of candidates were a factor, but it remains very difficult to determine the extent to which they swayed the elections. There were other more mundane elements at play as well. But what is certain is that the DPP lost quite a bit of momentum following those elections and found itself in a bit of a crisis. The lead up to the 2020 elections, and after Tsai finally secured nomination for the candidacy in those elections, the Chinese Communist Party very overtly placed its bets on Han Kuo-yu, the politician who had been elected mayor of Kaohsiung in the 2018 elections. There were worrying signs that he may have certain ties to the PRC, mostly resulting from a visit early after his election to Hong Kong, Xiamen, and other places in China, where he held closed-door meetings with a number of officials, including people from Taiwan Affairs Office. We saw a crude disinformation campaign targeting Taiwan again in the lead up to the elections, and signs again of a number of candidates in the blue camp who had been co-opted by the Chinese through financial incentives and all that. Very rarely because of purely ideological reasons. Now, it seems that those efforts failed. Tsai was re-elected, not only re-elected, but re-elected with a record-breaking 8 million votes, which was the highest number of votes ever obtained by a Taiwanese presidential candidate since the first direct elections were held in 1996. Now that led experts to try to guess how Beijing would respond to Tsai's re-election. We expected ramped up coercion. Beijing had already promised that if Tsai were re-elected, it would steal every single one of Taiwan's remaining official diplomatic allies. When we also foresaw, more military threats against Taiwan, those would, be the likeliest scenario. And by then, towards the end of 2019, Taiwan had adopted a number of measures and implemented new laws that made it easier for different law enforcement agencies to take action against individuals and organizations that were seen to be playing a role in external influence in Taiwan's affairs, and to combat sharp power, basically. So we were all guessing, we're all trying to figure out what's going to happen, and then COVID-19 hit. Well, actually, COVID-19 hit just as Taiwan was about to hold its elections, but none of that was made public. So late December last year, Taiwan already knew that trouble was brewing in Wuhan. It was able to make that determination largely through monitoring of social media in Taiwan and China, but also because it has a very substantive intelligence on the ground in China. And by this, I don't mean only intelligence agencies, but the fact that there are about 1.5 million Taiwanese business people working in China. They're known as Taishang, and a good number of them were based in Wuhan as well. So very early on, they were able to determine not only that there was a new disease, but that it was very likely transmissible from human to human. And one last thing as well, given its recent experiences with China, Taipei knew that it could not trust Beijing when it said that the epidemic was not as serious as it turned out to be. So in early January, Taiwan sent a notice to the World Health Organization, of which it is not a member, And that notice was duly ignored by officials there. And the message, as I just said, was that human-to-human transmission was very likely and that prompt action on a global level needed to be taken. So Taiwan, notwithstanding being ignored by the WHO, adopted early and rather drastic, if you will, measures. And that included banning flights from Wuhan in Hebei province and later extending those to other parts of China. And eventually a blanket ban on flights from China, basically. Beijing immediately sought to interfere and to create trouble, for example, in attempts by Taipei to repatriate Taiwanese nationals who were based in Wuhan. Ironically, when we are asked why it is that Taiwan has been so successful in combating the outbreak, one of the ironies is that it was certainly assisted by Beijing's decision to cut tourism to Taiwan. And by the time that the elections were held in January 2020, there were very, very few Chinese tourists in Taiwan. So the ability to bring the virus to Taiwan was very much limited by a policy that China had adopted in response to Tsai's election in 2016 and then re-election in 2020. There were limits due to curtail Taiwan Affairs Office, Mainland Affairs Council communication mechanism, which had been suspended not long after Tsai was elected in 2016. That certainly caused problems in cross-Strait communication to deal with the issue. So then that led to pro-Beijing business people becoming involved in negotiations. And some of them were known to have very close ties to Chinese Communist Party and United Front work departments. And they themselves played a role as well in trying to complicate Taiwan's efforts to bring back Taiwanese nationals. And then, so Beijing, with these individuals, tinkered with the flight manifests. Taiwan had submitted a list of 500 names that they saw as a priority to bring back to Taiwan, including some young individual who has, I believe he had leukemia. And then when Taiwanese officials went to China to bring them back, those people were missing, but there were a number of people on board who were not on the list, and that included a number of spouses of Taiwanese businessmen, the spouses who did not necessarily have ROC citizenship. So there was a bit of politics involved very early on. Then we saw disinformation campaign, fake news imagery, for example, suggesting that the Taiwanese government was hiding hundreds of deceased individuals in the basement of the Taipei Dome, for example. A lot of that fake imagery was of poor quality, so very early Taiwanese authorities were able to identify it and then to impose fines and punishments on people who were distributing it. But also disinformation and propaganda from the Chinese side claiming that Taiwan was incompetent, did not have the technology to respond to the challenge, and that ultimately only China knew how to deal with the crisis and all that. Now, I think a very important point as well is it made us discover again that even though not only China, but the international community were facing a major crisis, Beijing always compartmentalizes and will continue to do things that it regards as in the interest of its larger policies and ideological objectives. So for example, during the crisis, we saw ramped up activities by the Chinese in the South China Sea. So again, operating the artificial islands, augmenting capabilities there, and even early this week, sinking a Vietnamese fishing vessel in waters near the Paracel Islands. And again, we've seen this, China playing politics in times of crisis. For one thing, during the SARS outbreak in 2003, where we saw very much the kind of rhetoric that we're seeing today when it comes to Taiwan, or for example, the deadly earthquake in Nepal in 2015, when again, China played politics and was able to prevent Taiwanese search and rescue teams from going to Nepal to help with rescue efforts and all. Again, because China insisted on one China principle and all that. So the expansionist policies that we expected following Tsai's re-election did not cease because of COVID-19. They very much continued. They were probably increased. And China, the Chinese leadership probably saw an opportunity to continue coercing Taiwan due to the fact that the international community was distracted as it started dealing with the COVID-19 outbreak. Nevertheless, Taiwan has won worldwide recognition for its early response and subsequent handling of the crisis. And China's propaganda efforts have included both efforts to rewrite history and the timeline of COVID-19, as we've been seeing, but increasingly to undermine Taiwan's visibility. And again, the response by the Chinese embassy in Paris that I quoted earlier is a clear example of this. Beijing has resented the good, and I would argue unprecedented, publicity that Taiwan has been receiving as the world deals with COVID-19. We've seen strong reactions by Chinese embassies to any signal by governments that they are accepting aid from Taiwan or collaborating with Taiwan. So we saw that in the Czech Republic last week, for example, and there will be more to come. I would argue now that in the current context, that kind of behavior is self-defeating. Mass diplomacy and medical assistance certainly has demonstrated, as I said earlier, the transactional nature of Beijing's aid. For example, when it comes to France, making medical assistance predicated on the French government allowing Huawei to play a role in its 5G networks. And then, of course, Taiwan also saw an opportunity in all this, and it has played its game well, and it comes out looking much more altruistic and humanitarian in its offers of assistance than China has so far. Now, when it comes to international organizations, and as I said earlier, with Taiwan being unable not only to join, but even to be allowed as an observer, during Lunar New Year break this year, the International Civil Aviation Organization, based in Montreal, got involved in a bit of a scandal after a number of academics asked on their Twitter the reasons why Taiwan was not able to join or to access information it needed to track individuals who may have been infected with COVID-19. That resulted in dozens and dozens of individuals' accounts being blocked by ICAO, and the organization claiming, as we heard today from another organization, that Taiwan had orchestrated a campaign to tarnish the reputation of ICAO through a concerted internet campaign, if you will. We saw first hits of a blind spot caused by Taiwan being left out in the cold. And with that incident, and US members of Congress, State Department decided to weigh in with very vocal letters condemning ICAO's behavior when it came to the questions that had been raised about a role for Taiwan. That also highlighted early on the influence or growing influence of China within UN institutions. And as with the WHO today, that influence is certainly quite direct, given that the head of ICAO, Ms. Fang Liu, is herself a Chinese and used to work in civilian administration, aviation administration in China. Still, with help from allies and using ad hoc mechanisms, Taiwan has been, for the most part, able to access crucial information that it needs to respond to crises and developments. For example, the same formula was used during the World Games in Kaohsiung in 2009 and the Taipei Universiade in 2017, when it could not access information for Interpol. And there were indications that those events might be targeted by international terrorist organizations. So partners in the international community found ways to make sure that Taiwan could access the information that it needed to respond. And we're seeing signs that Taiwan and partners are doing the same thing when it comes to responding to COVID-19. Now, as we saw with his latest press conference yesterday, the head of WHO, Dr. Tedros, made accusations that Taiwan had launched a racist campaign against him, countenanced by Taiwan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And again, this kind of rhetoric can only lead to speculation about his serving the interests of Beijing, as opposed to the interests of the international community in combating COVID-19. Does not only involve Mr. Tedros, but also Dr. Bruce Aylward, who is a Canadian national like myself. In his controversial interview with RTHK from Hong Kong, when being asked about Taiwan, he claimed that he could not hear the question and then subsequently hung up on the poor female reporter. Now, I would argue that the PRC is still making inroads in some parts of the world with its propaganda campaign and its mass diplomacy, particularly 17+1 countries. So we saw Serbia, for example, the head of state being very vocal in his support for China, while lamenting the supposed mishandling of the crisis and lack of attention by the European Union. Africa is probably another playground where China will make some inroads as part of its propaganda campaign surrounding COVID-19. China will likely attempt to come out of this crisis in a stronger position within international institutions, especially if the EU and the US pull out or decide to reduce their engagement within those organizations. And as we saw with President Trump announcing yesterday, there is now a possibility that the United States would withhold funding to the WHO in response to the behavior that we've seen over Taiwan and other areas. That could work, but that could also give China more space to increase its influence within those organizations. The future impact of all of this for Taiwan is uncertain. It could benefit Taiwan if democracies work in concert in future to include Taiwan. And then if that were to happen, it remains to be seen how Beijing would react. It's hard to imagine that it would allow Taiwan to get away with greater engagement. But it could also harm Taiwan if Beijing prevails and increases its influence within the UN system, as I just mentioned. My assessment is that Taiwan will come out of this, I don't know when, but will come out of this looking pretty good. And with the possibility of a much more substantial ties with a number of countries worldwide. Will that lead to official diplomatic ties? I don't believe so. But my fear, however, is how Beijing would react to this. And given the trends within the CCP and Xi's ideology and tighter controls in China due to COVID-19, this could lead to a much more belligerent stance on Taiwan and greater tensions in the Taiwan Strait. Especially if there are fears in China that the CCP's image has been tarnished by its handling of COVID-19, then that could compel Beijing authorities to move towards a policy of externalization, and that would make Taiwan a prime target. And finally, to mention my new book again, I conclude that book with 5 possible scenarios, and I believe, and as I argue in the book, and this is unchanged by COVID-19, that the likeliest scenario would be escalation short of a military attack against Taiwan with a full component of increased political warfare, coercion, intimidation, and attempts to isolate Taiwan. So I will conclude here, and I do look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Michael, for a brilliant presentation. I want to remind people who signed on late that there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and you can click on that to submit questions, and I will moderate the questions, and Michael will respond. I'll take the moderator's prerogative to put out the first question, and that is, in the discussions about what may change and what opportunities Taiwan might have internationally in light of the COVID-19 pandemic and the hit that China's PR took and the Chinese model took early on. The United States and European Union and Japan, Australia, Taiwan's traditional partners or sympathetic allies are getting all of the attention. I was wondering if you could address how COVID-19 plays in the competition between China and Taiwan in the rest of the world, for example, Southeast Asia, India, other places, and whether you think that COVID-19 changes the dynamics of Taiwan's possibilities on the international scene by working with those partners as well.
Right. Well, a lot of this will be contingent on two things: on the quality of Chinese propaganda and its ability to convince targeted audience, but also on how dependent on the Chinese market or Chinese economy or Chinese investment those countries are as well. I think, again, a clear example is we've seen rising skepticism within some 17+1 countries in Central Eastern Europe, Czech Republic being quite vocal as well. But if you look at countries like Serbia, it would be immensely difficult for Taiwan to gainsay China in their PR, their war for public relations and all that. Southeast Asia, again, it depends on the countries in question. I believe Taiwan would have a good chance of making inroads in Vietnam, for example, in part because of the greater context and certainly what happened in the South China Sea this week, but also the history of economic ties between Taiwan and Vietnam, but also the skepticism that the Vietnamese have historically had towards China and its intentions. So that's an area where Taiwan could possibly score some success. But if you look at countries like Burma or Cambodia, those countries and their governments have been, for all intents and purposes, co-opted by the Chinese through heavy investment, military assistance and whatnot. Again, I don't think that Taiwanese offers of assistance would succeed in having a major or substantial impact on the quality of its relations with those countries. So we really need to look at each and every country and place it in a context. But nonetheless, I believe as well that if leading democracies become more vocal on, again, the transactional, sometimes crass nature of Chinese offers of assistance, as that gets publicized, I assume that would trickle down in other societies as well and make them a little bit more aware of how China operates. And oftentimes, in recent years, China has been able to get away with that kind of behavior, mostly because those countries are led by corrupt governments, or simply because people do not know who they're dealing with, and they assume that they're dealing with a regular country that does not operate like a Marxist-Leninist country like China is under the CCP. So that process of education has certainly been accelerated due to COVID-19, and I don't see how that could not be to Taiwan's advantage. But again, I don't want to oversell the gains that Taiwan will make in all this outside of a small group of major democracies that already have a history of engagement with Taiwan.
Thank you, Michael. Our first question comes from one of our partners at the Stanford Internet Observatory, who asks if you could expand a little bit on the disinformation campaign during the lead up to the 2020 elections, and specifically where the campaign was coming from and who was behind it. Do we have any evidence, reliable evidence that could help us answer those questions?
Well, it's certainly multifaceted. There is the self-initiated cyber army that will operate on Twitter and Weibo and all that. But there's also the more official rhetoric coming out of state-controlled media in China, certain Weibo accounts that have been tracked, IP addresses and connected to certain institutions in China with ties to the military or United Front Work Department. A lot of the rhetoric that came out of China was almost verbatim what was being proposed by their favorite candidate, so that is Hangori of the KMT. Again, very much emphasizing the need to embrace the so-called 1992 consensus, but also, and Hangori repeatedly said that, claiming that we need to put politics aside and concentrate on making money. And Hangori very much proposed a policy of much deeper engagement with China. And all of that was supported by disinformation campaign or propaganda campaign by not only by the Chinese side, but also by a number of elements within Taiwan. Some content farms as well, operated by Taiwanese businessmen who had attended the new media forums in Xiamen, for example, and operated a constellation of websites that tended to regurgitate propaganda that came from Weibo, that came from official state media, and then was picked up by traditional media in Taiwan, some of them complicitly, also to assist Chinese efforts. It was I was a bit dispirited in the lead up to the elections because there was so much disinformation across Taiwan coming from all over the place, from Malaysia, from China, from within Taiwan. It made it very difficult to make sense of where it came from sometimes. But we do have organizations in Taiwan that have been identifying and tracking different outlets and IP addresses, as I said, and Facebook fan pages that had ties to pro-unification groups that all of a sudden changed their names and became Hangori fan pages and all that. I would not claim that every single one of those was paid for or co-opted by the Chinese, but there certainly was a good share of those that were. And to that, I add the political parties that I mentioned earlier, the China Unification Promotion Party, Red Party Taiwan, New Party, very explicitly supporting one country, two systems unification, and their own efforts to spread disinformation and support candidates that were deemed more palatable to Beijing.
Mm-hmm. We have a question coming in from one of our attendees asking you to consider how the PRC's response vis-a-vis cross-strait relations during the COVID-19 crisis may differ or might have differed from its response during SARS. Could you compare how those two episodes of virus epidemic played out in terms of cross-strait relations?
Right. Well, I had not arrived in Taiwan yet when SARS hit. I was actually, ironically, I was in Toronto, which also was dealing with SARS. But again, at the time, the head of WHO was Margaret Chan from Hong Kong. And back then, she also faced accusations that she was basically doing Beijing's bid at the organization. So again, it's the same issues with Taiwan claiming that it was unable to access the kind of information that it needed or to receive assistance from international organizations that it needed to deal with the crisis. But again, as COVID-19 has demonstrated, I think if a country is well prepared to deal with the crisis, it doesn't necessarily need the WHO. Taiwan learned a lot of lessons from 2003 in that they did not have a centralized agency to coordinate response back then. So they learned a lot from that as well. So they were a lot more prepared this time around to deal with that kind of contingency. I don't recall seeing the kind of propaganda campaign that we're seeing today during the SARS crisis, and largely because back then China was not a global power as it is today. It was not led like someone as ideological as Xi Jinping is today. But certainly with Chen Shui-bian in office in Taiwan, China's stance on Taiwan was quite problematic. But there was not this I do not recall, and again, as I said, I wasn't here, but I do not recall attempts to repatriate Taiwanese from China, as we saw this time around as well. So there were fewer vectors through which China could try to interfere. But again, it was the same accusations that WHO was putting politics in China ahead of international health. It was a much more limited outbreak in scale as well. The number of countries affected were much fewer than we're facing today. So in many levels, it's a completely different game as well when it comes to propaganda and all that.
Right, right. We have a couple of attendees who are interested in your view on what the right path forward with regards to the WHO and international organization should be for Taiwan's friends in the world. You know, President Trump recently has excoriated the WHO and threatened to withhold funding. And the question one of our attendees asks is if you think that that would actually play to China and give them an opportunity to increase their international influence in the world, and similarly in the ICAO. And so what is the right call here for Taiwan's friends and for countries that are interested in combating China's influence?
Right. Well, you know, it's interesting that what President Trump said in terms of threatening to withhold financial assistance to WHO. If that threat were serious enough that it compels the agency to mend its ways and perhaps act as a more responsible agency, I would favor that policy. But my fear is that, and we've seen this with human rights and other UNESCO and all that at the UN. When Western democracies pull out, China tends to quickly fill that vacuum. So in the long run, I'm not convinced that pulling out would be in the interest of the international community. And I would not be surprised if whatever money the United States decides to withhold, that China would be more than happy to provide that money. China has money to do these things. So a better solution would be, in my opinion, really a truly concerted effort by as large as possible a number of influential democracies, calling for a thorough investigation of authoritarian influence within the United Nations, not just specialized organizations, but all the way to the top. There was a controversy a few years ago involving Patrick Ho from Hong Kong, who bribed individuals at UN General Assembly. And to this day, the Secretary General of the United Nations has refused to have an internal investigation conducted when that was as clear a signal as you can get of the Chinese trying to influence UN organizations. So I think the time has come for countries to be very serious, calling for not only investigations at the UN, but reform, so that undue influence by any country, but particularly by countries that are, human rights violators, will not have the ability to rewrite the rules of the international system. And that's what we're seeing right now with countries like China and Russia, and in certain instances, Iran and other violators. Pulling out is not the solution, but they really need to be adamant and sustained in their efforts to change that system. I believe it can change that system, but you have to stay within it to be able to change it. And if that means bringing in countries like Taiwan or finding mechanisms to make sure that a democracy of 23.8 million people is not a blind spot in that system, then they should be able to do that as well.
Thank you. We have a question from Tom Gold, who would like to know exactly what the KMT has been up to since the election, and in particular, Han Guoyu. And also, what do we know about the involvement of Taiwan firms in BRI? Does Taiwan have any TICO-style offices in the Central Asian countries deeply involved in the Belt and Road Initiative?
Okay, well, what the KMT has exactly been up to since the elections, well, it has a new chairman, Johnny Jiang, who is a ethnic Taiwanese, which is a bit of a rarity within the KMT that tends to have Waishan or mainlander, if you will, leadership. He was given charge of a party that very much self-destructed in the lead up to the elections in 2020. There were a lot of factions fighting for influence, but also it became clear that Han Kuo-yu had become a bit of an accidental candidate for those elections. And while the KMT was, I guess it was okay with Mr. Han being mayor of Kaohsiung, they had issues with he was a political outlier within the system, with very few accomplishments and very few policies. And he was not from the mainstream factions that tend to be highly educated and have personal wealth and all. So he wasn't part of the elite within the KMT. So what happened is that as he began piling up controversies, and there were signs that he was an alcoholic, showed up very late for work, and said a number of things pertaining to Southeast Asian workers in Taiwan and all that, that made the elite KMT think twice about supporting him. So what we saw in the weeks leading up to the election is that the pillars within the KMT, who have historically organized rallies and generated momentum, simply pulled out, and they refused to support Han Kuo-yu. So that had an impact on mobilization for Han. And on election day, what this meant is that people who traditionally vote blue or KMT did vote for the KMT on the party list. They voted KMT in the legislative elections, which were being held concurrently with the presidential election. But a good number of them did not vote for Han Kuo-yu. Whereas the Tsai Ing-wen side was highly mobilized, particularly young voters, and that accounts for her obtaining a record-breaking 8 million votes. So now the KMT is, again, looking for a new direction. There's been calls since forever for rejuvenation of the party and empowering young people. But there's been resistance among the older generations within the KMT, the dinosaurs, who control the money. So it's been very difficult for any party leader to, bring about the kind of change and modernization of the party that would make it a competitive party again in elections. Johnny Chiang.
Before we turn to the next question, I wonder if you could quickly address the BRI dimension and whether Taiwan is active in the Belt and Road in any way.
Right. Well, Taiwan has already made it clear that it doesn't seek to compete with BRI, and it couldn't anyway. It doesn't have the resources. But it certainly has expressed interest in working, particularly with Japan, on infrastructure projects across Southeast Asia and pretty much all of BRI. And Japan itself has said that it does not seek to compete with China, but possibly act in a more complementary way in that part of the world. If there are companies that are playing a direct role in BRI, possibly, but this is not an area that I've paid a lot of attention to, so I can only speculate, but I would rather not make any pronouncements.
Right. We have one participant who notes that within an increasing share of Taiwan's public is identifying as Taiwanese and not necessarily as Chinese, and that a larger share of the public also favors redesignating the country as Taiwan rather than the Republic of China. And so the question is, do you think the current status quo is stable from a domestic Taiwanese political perspective?
Well, status quo is never static to begin with. I mean, Beijing has been moving the goalposts for quite a while, and certainly under Xi Jinping. The majority of the public in Taiwan is still in favor of maintaining some sort of status quo, i.e. no declaration of de jure independence and no unification with China. The problem for Beijing is that it has not been able to or willing to propose anything better than one country, two systems, and that is a defunct offer for the Taiwanese, even for the more pro-Beijing elements within the KMT. From my experience, the majority of Taiwanese recognize the existence of the People's Republic of China. There is no denying the fact that it exists. But what they would like is also for recognition that they have a different nation. And I would argue that there's two types of independence movements in Taiwan. There's the Taidus, or Taiwanese independence, but there's also what we call the Huadu, which is more traditional supporters of the Republic of China. And that tends to sit more with the blue camp within Taiwan as well. What I have argued over the years, and through my exchanges with people in both camps, is the fact that they won't admit it, but ultimately they are arguing the same thing. The designation might be different, but the reasons why they support that independence is support for way of life, democratic institutions, liberalism and whatnot. Oftentimes goes unacknowledged, and you still have the divide between blue and green camps, but they tend to agree on a lot more than they disagree on. But that simply cannot be, they simply cannot admit to that. The problem that we're seeing is that the PRC regards itself as a successor regime to the ROC. So the PRC denies the continued existence of the ROC. So as long as the Chinese side refuses to countenance a model that permits the existence of two separate entities, even perhaps under a federal mechanism, it's going to be very difficult to imagine that the status quo can be held indefinitely. And my fear is that if at some point Beijing really concludes that all its non-kinetic efforts have failed, and this is what we're seeing as well, economic inducements, coercion, political warfare, and you see all the trend lines are moving in the opposite direction in Taiwan, then there could be one day when China believes that it has no choice but to resort to force, and that the regional or global context is such that China would get away with that kind of action. So I would argue at this point that the maintenance of some sort of status quo in the Taiwan Strait will be contingent on not only Taiwan having a sufficient deterrent capability, but also international partners making it then clear that any use of force by China against Taiwan would trigger a major response and have very serious repercussions from China. We need that kind of signaling now. I think the strategic ambiguity that we've seen in Taiwan Strait over decades has outlived its purpose, and we need to see more clear commitments by a community of nations, countries like US and Japan, EU and others, to peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait.
Thank you. We have a question from a journalist who notes that even before COVID-19 broke out, the US administration in particular was talking about a range of measures that are sometimes described as decoupling economically, particularly with respect to sensitive supply chains. The questioner asks whether you think COVID-19 will affect that significantly and what Taiwan's role actually can be in the redirection of supply chains out of China and the diversification of everything from pharmaceuticals to technology and other areas.
Well, there's no doubt in my mind that COVID-19 will accelerate or increase incentives for decoupling, or at least, if not decoupling, at least diversification in different sectors. Again, the transactional nature of Chinese behavior that we've seen under COVID-19 the fact that it, for all intents and purposes, holds the lives of people in different countries hostage to Beijing's politics or to the desire for Huawei to be allowed into their markets, cannot but make it very clear to people globally that in times of crisis, they cannot always depend on China and its market for things that they need for their own safety. So again, production of masks is a clear example. There's shortages worldwide. China produces millions and upon millions of masks, but makes its offers conditional on certain promises and commitments. Now, Taiwan has, as I said, adopted a more humanitarian stance on this and demonstrated as well that very quickly it could turn around and become a major producer of facial masks. And it should have taken 6 months. Within a month, they had brought this up to 10 million masks per day. By the end of this month, they should reach something like 14, if not 15 million masks. So it demonstrating again its industrial capabilities and all that. But absolutely right. The question about decoupling started well before COVID-19, due to trade war and increased apprehensions about the risks of allowing certain investments in technologies from China in our communities. Canada is going through that same debate with Huawei as well. The problem is one of capability, and the whole production chain. China was very intelligent in that they not only allowed companies and manufacturers to establish themselves in China, but they built that whole infrastructure as well to facilitate import of materials, but also export of finished products. So it's not only a matter of moving manufacturers from China to places like Taiwan or Southeast Asia, but with that you need to move the whole infrastructure as well and the whole supply chain. That's going to take longer. But if we are, and I believe we're on the brink of being there, if we are in a new kind of Cold War or ideological war on the global scale involving China, it's very difficult to imagine that you would not start seeing the kind of decoupling that we're discussing here. But its success will again be predicated on not only United States, but other major countries, Germany, EU members, Japan, certainly, Australia, India, agreeing to work together and develop the kind of alternatives that would be necessary to make that a reality. We're not there yet, and we'll see after COVID-19 is over, if it ever ends, what kind of impact it will have had on Beijing's image overseas.
So much of the discussion about cross-strait relations, of course, focuses on governmental activity, particularly with respect to international organizations. International organizations respond to governments and not directly to people. What role do you think civil society and people-to-people relations can play in an international environment that typically listens to what state governments say? Does Taiwanese civil society, does the Taiwanese public have a role to play in appealing to international organizations and in appealing to like-minded partners around the world to advance Taiwan's position in the world?
Well, Taiwan is certainly blessed with a very vibrant, politicized, aware civil society, and that's the outcome of its whole democratization process in the 1980s and all that. Up until recently, however, civil society did not know how to communicate Taiwan's situation within the international community. Oftentimes, it was simply due to linguistic barriers. That changed with the Sunflower Movement when I think civil society realized that they needed to bring this to a global level. And with that, we saw, press briefings in different languages down to Arabic, which we had never seen before. And since then, I've sensed that civil society has invested a lot more in having individuals who, probably studied overseas or were born overseas and came back to Taiwan to help out, or are still based overseas but helping out as well in their own ways. So that has certainly played a role in raising awareness overseas about what's going on. But again, the greatest gift in all of this has been Xi Jinping's home behavior. And as people start paying more attention to China and its behavior and its sharp power and how its activities are undermining our own democratic institutions, it also compels people to, probably learn a little bit more about the alternative to what China is proposing, and that is next door Taiwan. And Taiwan in recent years, probably also because the Taiwanese government under Tsai Ing-wen has been a bit more vocal on these things and willing to assist civil society, has amplified that message. But what we've seen as well, I mentioned GCTF earlier. GCTF is orchestrated by US government and Taiwanese government and increasingly partner governments. But it brings together a large number of members of civil society, from NDI to counterpart organizations in Japan and Sweden, journalists from different countries, even from Pacific Islands that are currently being targeted by the Chinese. So we've seen this coming together, if you will, of the Taiwanese government and civil society, which has not always been the case. And with that, I hope the recognition that the Taiwanese government on its own cannot and does not know how to operate a proper PR campaign to explain itself to the international community. They need tech-savvy young individuals, they need journalists, they need PR specialists and all that. And up until recently, I don't think the Taiwanese government really understood the need to do that, but that appears to be changing. And I suspect that will have a positive impact for Taiwan. Also, I would add international attention in the media. The major newspapers may not be based in Taiwan, but more and more they are reporting on Taiwan. Since 2016, it has been markedly more favorable to Taiwan, when in previous years it oftentimes depicted Taiwan as a troublemaker and it was ill understood and all that. That narrative has changed quite dramatically. Again, we can thank Xi Jinping for that. And through these, I would argue that there are a number of countries where it's very difficult to move China policy with governments. But if you educate the public, not only about China, but also about Taiwan, hopefully that will have a bit of a snowball effect. And the public will start demanding more from their governments. And so you're going to have pressure from below, if you will. And then that could have an impact on policy decisions by governments like Canada, for example.
Right. Thank you, Michael, for a brilliant presentation and wonderful answers to the questions. I would like to refer our attendees, if you didn't see it at the beginning of the presentation, to the email address for our Hoover Taiwan program so that you can join our announcement list. We expect to hold our next event in early May. It will be a high-profile event dealing with Taiwan's success and hopefully continued success in dealing with the COVID-19 virus. We'll have a number of experts from the public health community who are discussing it in those terms, rule of law, and also civil society. And we hope to have a senior member of Taiwan government joining the conversation as well. So keep your eye out for that, and please join our list. And thank you for coming today. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.